Hi, friends. I'm sorry if I sound like I'm talking in a tin can. My Bluetooth Yeti is not working. Not that I ever sounded that great, but fighting the Great War. We saw in the last video how an assassination attempt, or a successful assassination in the Balkans, triggered this large war that happened really before anybody knew it was happening. The mobilization was huge. This is going to be the largest war the world had ever seen at the time. The French mobilized 8.5, the British 9 million, the Russians 12 million. The German mobilized 11 million, and 1/4 of all of these mobilized soldiers would not come back, as our textbook states. And of those who came back, many are maimed and blind, and some are mad. We will see the advent of trench warfare on the Western Front. This war would take all types of new forms. We have machine guns, British soldiers forced to wear masks due to the potential of gas attacks. This is at the Battle of the Somme. Here, Austrian soldiers are marching into Russia to deal with unbearable cold. And we'll see that if this is, again, the mindset of most of the soldiers in 1914 at the onset of all sides, the British, Germans, Russians, this will certainly be the mood by 1918 throughout this war. This is, again, Felix Kammer portraying Paul Baumer in the film adaptation, another film adaptation of All Quiet on the Western Front, the war novel by Eric Remy Remarque. The early stages of the war. Germany and Austria-Hungary are again allied, and there was something known as the Scheifling Plan, named for a German general who passed away actually in 1913. His name was Alfred von Scheifelen. And the Scheifelen Plan called for an invasion. First, because Germany is bordered by Russia and France on its east and west, respectively, it doesn't want to fight a two-front war. So the plan under the Scheifling Plan was to invade France through neutral Belgium and push the French to be forced to surrender so that they could return to the Eastern Front to deal with the Russians. So first to knock out France and then to deal with Russia. This plan was predicated on the notion that it would take longer for Moscow to mobilize its soldiers. If it's drawing on soldiers from these parts of Russia, it will take them longer to travel and mobilize to the east because the rail networks are still not as great in Russia. It's more difficult to travel through that terrain. The Scheifling Plan initially was successful. However, Russia mobilized faster than the Germans had anticipated, and they also met some resistance through Belgium, which was neutral at the time and was slowed down. The Scheifling Plan, again, would invade France through neutral Belgium. But Russia initially won some victories in the east, forcing Germany to send troops back east. The Russians did suffer a tremendous defeat, though, at the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914, the first major engagement between the Central Powers and Russia. The general of the Russian army at Tannenberg died by suicide after the conflict because a record number of troops were surrounded and forced to surrender. But we'll see Russia will draw on an incredible amount of manpower to continue to fight in the war for several years. The Germans were within the outskirts of Paris until they were stopped at the Battle of the Marne in 1914, aided by the British, who came to assist France because of the invasion through neutral Belgium. The UK, that was the last straw. So the British and the French are fighting against the Germans in the West. And in the West, the front would barely change over the course of the next 4 years. Here's where all of the fighting took place, and there was hardly any other movements, at least on the Western Front. This is the advent of trench warfare. The British soldiers in a trench, the German soldiers in another trench, no man's land in between, where one side would again charge at the other in an attempt to overrun a trench, but most of the time it was unsuccessful due to the massive fortifications that both sides had. Our textbook explains trench warfare, a series of trenches that stretch from, again, the coast all the way to the Swiss Alps. Brutal conditions, soldiers sleeping in mud with rats, with lice. The disease was lethal. When soldiers would try to overrun an enemy trench, it was known as going over the top, which would result in... Why does I keep doing that? No, stop. When soldiers would run over and try to take the enemy's side, the text shows a great passage that I'll read. It says, in French warfare, the blue French cloth mingled with the German gray upon the ground, and in some cases the bodies were piled so high that one could take cover from shell fire behind them. The noise was so terrific that order had to be shouted by each man into the ear of the next. And whenever there was a momentary lull in the fighting and the groans of the wounded, one heard, high up in the blue sky, the joyful song of birds singing just as they do at home in springtime. It was enough to tear the heart out of one's body. That's from Richard Schmeider that's a German soldier writing from the trenches in France. It's in the film 1917, actually. The film starts with two British soldiers walking in this beautiful countryside and down into the trenches. It's just crazy how trench warfare just destroyed the land, but imagine just seeing the beauty in between. These battles would be marked by very high casualty rates. The British and the French halted the German advance at the Battle of the Marne in 1914. The Germans were again repelled by the French at the Battle of Verdun, which was an 11-month struggle that cost 500,000 casualties on each side. And when the Allies tried to break through at the Battle of Somme, they were repelled by the Germans. 60,000 British soldiers were killed on one day. To put that into perspective, because sometimes students have a hard time, how many is 60,000 soldiers? I'm having all kinds of troubles today. A picture of Progressive Field on here because I teach in Ohio. This is a venue that has about 40,000 people that can seat 40,000. Add on another 20, and that's how many casualties the British suffered on just one day at the Somme. It's truly mind-boggling. The rest of the war was fought on other fronts as well too. I put the note down here that many events in World War I set the stage for World War II, which we'll see in a minute. Bulgaria joins the Central Powers in an attempt to require some territory and inflicts some defeats on Serbia. Romania joined the Allied side, only to be crushed by the Central Powers. And while all of this is happening, Japan began acquiring German overseas colonies after Japan joined the Allies. This is going to be the Japanese Empire at its extent, but while the European powers were fighting, we again saw back several units. Japan was the one country that began to industrialize prior to the European and American countries colonizing most of the world and setting up imperial colonies. Japan is growing as a power, and they're going to do what European countries had done 40, 60 years earlier. They began acquiring more territory in order to fuel its imperialistic ambitions. Italy also joined the Allies, but was locked in stalemate with Austria-Hungary for most of the war. In this section, there was, again, major stalemates on both sides. And I wrote down the text again from Barbara Tuchman, the great author. Germany tried to secure an alliance with Japan, but it failed. Japan joined the Allies, and it says it's going to take advantage of this war to gain control of China, foretold President Yuan Shikai. Europe will watch as Japan will impose these 21 demands on China, which were a series of unfair treaties that China couldn't repay, which also involved taking area in Manchuria here. And Barbara Tuchman writes, and to make the incursions into Chinese sovereignty and territory, which were to twist the history of the 20th century. We can see, in many respects, World War I will begin really in 1931 in the East, in Manchuria, with Japan acquiring more territories. Again, stages in World War I will set the stage for World War II. The war was still a global conflict. There was fighting in the East, and the Ottoman Empire, which was now known as the sick man of Europe, joined the Central Powers, in part due to an incident called the Goeben Incident, in which a German ship sailed through the Dardanelles into the Black Sea, and there was some confusion about what was actually happening. Barbara Tuchman writes about it in her book, but the Germans kind of forced the Ottomans to join their side. The British attempted to defeat the Ottomans at the Battle of Gallipoli and cut off trade, but they were actually defeated, and this cut off trade between the Allies and Russia. This is young Winston Churchill, one of his ideas and one of his perhaps most famous blunders. They were defeated at the Dardanelles. We still have Arab lands here especially this is now part of the Ottoman Empire. They're again beginning to revolt, and they're discontented with the rule of the Ottomans. So there's a series of nationalistic revolts led by Hussein ibn Ali over much of the Middle East. These are ethnic groups that are demanding independence and recognition from the Ottoman Empire, and they were aided by a famous T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, famously becomes known as Lawrence of Arabia. He led guerrilla raids against the Ottomans, made famous by the movie Lawrence of Arabia. I learned about this in a great book, The Fall of the Ottomans. Within the Ottoman Empire, and Baghdad actually later fell to the British. We can talk about requests for oil in this region as well, too. The British landed in the Persian Gulf and took Baghdad. The Middle East is going to be shaped by the Allied powers, who will try to redraw the map and again move around a bunch of different ethnicities and nationalities and peoples, which will set the stage for later conflict. The Armenian Genocide occurs at this time as well within the Ottoman Empire. And really, as I was thinking about making this video, it's almost, the Armenian Genocide was such a loss of life, it almost deserves really its complete separate focus of attention. I don't think it's right really within this video to just treat it as a component or another piece of what happened, but I thought about connecting the Armenian Genocide with the war in the East. But this is, again, a very solemn subject, something that demands grave attention and understanding and empathy, because what happened was absolutely atrocious. You had ethnic Armenian Christians who were living in the present-day eastern Turkey, mostly under Ottoman rule, some under Russian rules in the Caucasus here. And many of these Armenian Christians were quite prosperous, but as Christians in the Ottoman Empire, they did not enjoy the same rights as the mostly Muslims living within the Ottoman Empire. And when the Russians had any kind of success in the Caucasus fighting against the Ottomans, the Armenians were blamed for aiding the enemy, for telling Russians where the Ottomans were, for supplying Russian soldiers with equipment or housing them. So they were blamed deliberately. And beginning by 1915, Armenians were first on large marches eastward to nowhere, resulting in hundreds of thousands, millions being killed. This is depicted by the American ambassador, Henry Morgenthau. He says the real purpose of the deportation was robbery and destruction. It really represented a new method of massacre. When the Turkish authorities gave the orders for these deportations, they were merely giving the death warrant to a whole race. They understood this well, and in their conversations with me, they made no particular attention to conceal the fact. Here's a depiction of a forced march of ethnic Armenians, many who perished within the journey. Anywhere between 600,000 and 1.5 million Armenians were killed. I learned that Henry Morgenthau was the grandfather of Barbara Tuchman, who has informed my understanding of so much of World War I with, again, the book The Guns of August. So that's a neat connection. The First World War was, in fact, a world war. We go back to imperialism in 1900. This is still the way the world looked at the time. You had Indian conscripts digging trenches in the Western Front. You had French imperialists trying to acquire German territorial concessions in West Africa. You had soldiers from Bangladesh and Pakistan fighting and aiding the British and the French too. Here's a depiction of French soldiers at the Battle of Verdun. And I wrote down, if you were a soldier in West Africa born in 1875, you fought in the war maybe by 1915, you were 41 years old. So you were born into ethnic West Africa, colonized in this case by the French, and now you're fighting in a stalemate war in France. Who are these imperialist countries? German colonies in West Africa were overrun. What's their nationality? Who are they? Why are they doing this? I wrote down history isn't always gray, because people in the colonies had mixed feelings about serving. Some were reluctant to serve because they weren't treated fairly. Other colonial troops volunteered eagerly. They expected that their service would be a step towards citizenship or independence. Such hopes would be dashed after the war. The stolen land that was imperialized by 10 11 European countries and the United States, because of the advent of Industrial Revolution, would not receive recognition following the end of the war.